Have you ever looked up at the stars or down at the ground beneath your feet and wondered what came before us? Not just before our cities, our history books, or even our species, but before humanity itself. What if our story isn't the first? What if long before our time, another civilization walked this same earth, built their own world, and then vanished, leaving almost nothing behind but whispers in stone and echoes in the soil? Tonight, we'll drift into that question, following the trail through deep time, through mystery, and through the possibilities that lie just beyond what we can prove. If your curiosity finds comfort in the unknown, and you love exploring the edges of history and imagination, I'd love for you to join this journey. Subscribe to Beyond Our Dawn, and together, we'll keep asking the questions that make the universe and our own planet feel endless. Close your eyes for a moment, if you can, and just listen. Not to the hum of your refrigerator, or the faint whisper of traffic in the distance, or even to the familiar rhythm of your own heartbeat. Imagine listening beneath all of that, past the everyday noise, past the things we always hear without noticing. Imagine tuning yourself to something deeper, slower, older. If you could somehow do that, you might just catch the heartbeat of the earth itself. It's not fast, it's not loud, it's not even constant in the way a living pulse is, but it's there, a slow exhale that takes thousands, sometimes millions of years. And within that breath, there are stories. Now imagine the earth as a book. Not the kind you can hold in your hands, but a book so large it would take oceans for ink and mountain ranges for pages. Every page is made of stone and ice and the dust of ancient oceans. Every chapter tells of an age, the birth of continents, the rise of forests taller than cathedrals, the age of creatures so strange they feel like dreams when we dig them up. But here's the thing, some chapters are missing. Not because someone tore them out with malice, but because the book itself rewrites and erases as it goes. The earth is not a perfect archivist. It forgets, it edits, it hides. We, as humans, like to think we're the latest and greatest chapter in this enormous book. We look back through the pages, we can still read the pyramids, the petroglyphs, the scattered pottery shards, and we imagine that's where the story begins. But what if it isn't? What if there were whole chapters about civilizations we've never heard of? Civilizations, not from the stars, not from legend, but born right here, breathing our air, walking our land. What if they thought and built and dreamed long before the first humans ever chipped a stone? And what if they vanished so completely that we don't even realize they were ever here? It sounds like a question you might ask in the last glow of a campfire when the night is heavy and your mind starts to wander. But it's also a question some scientists, quietly and seriously, have asked. Could there have been another civilization on Earth before us? If there had been, would we even know? You might think the answer is simple. If there were others before us, we'd find their ruins, their tools, their bones. But the truth is, the Earth is a master at erasing. Given enough time, it can swallow cities, crush mountains, melt metal, and scatter memories into grains of sand. Geologists have a term for the kind of time we're talking about: deep time. It's a scale so vast our minds can't really hold it. We can picture 100 years, maybe 1,000, but 1,000,000, 10 million, 100 million. These are spans in which whole continents drift across the globe, where oceans appear and disappear, where entire species rise and fall and leave barely a trace. In deep time, even the tallest buildings we've ever made are as temporary as footprints on the beach. There's even a name for this thought. Experiment in science circles. The Silurian Hypothesis. It's a little inside joke, borrowing its title from an old British sci-fi series in which an intelligent reptilian species ruled the Earth before humans. But behind the playful name is a serious idea. Two researchers, Gavin Schmidt and Adam Frank, posed the question: if an industrial civilization had existed millions of years ago, would we be able to detect it in the geological record? And perhaps more unsettling, if it had existed, could we already have found traces of it without realizing what we were looking at? They weren't imagining skyscrapers buried under Antarctic ice or cell phones trapped in coal seams. They were talking about subtler signs, changes in the atmosphere's chemical makeup, shifts in carbon isotope ratios, unusual deposits of synthetic compounds that don't occur naturally. These things, if they happened on a planetary scale, might leave whispers in the rock layers that last long after the builders are gone. The problem is, deep time doesn't just bury things, it recycles them. The surface of our planet is constantly being ground up, melted down, and reshaped. Plate tectonics, the slow movement of Earth's crust, acts like a conveyor belt feeding ancient rock into the furnace of the mantle. Over millions of years, even the most durable artifacts are pulled down, melted, and reborn as new stone. Erosion and weathering take care of the rest, breaking down whatever is left on the surface grain by grain. Think about our own cities. A skyscraper left untended will start to crumble within decades. Steel rusts, concrete cracks, glass shatters. In 100 years, it might be a skeleton of itself. In 1,000, it could be unrecognizable. In 1,000,000, even if fragments survive, they'd be indistinguishable from natural rock unless preserved in some extraordinary way. And in 10 million years, you'd never know they were there. So, if there had been others before us, how would we find them? We might not be able to uncover their monuments or machinery. We'd have to look for the chemical fingerprints they left behind, evidence in the layers of the Earth itself. But the search is tricky. Nature leaves its own fingerprints all the time. Volcanic eruptions, asteroid impacts, massive climate shifts. Separating what might be a sign of intelligent activity from what could be a quirk of nature is like trying to guess the author of a sentence. When half the letters are smudged away, still the question lingers. Not because we have proof, but because we understand now how easily proof could vanish. And maybe that's the most humbling thought of all, that we could share this planet's history with civilizations we will never meet, and never even know about. The pages they wrote in the great book of Earth might have been erased, but maybe, just maybe, a few faded words remain, waiting for someone to notice that the Earth doesn't keep a perfect diary, but if it did, you'd find that much of what it records is in the language of chemistry rather than in words or pictures. It notes the rise and fall of carbon dioxide levels the way a human might jot down changes in the weather. It records the sudden arrival of new elements in concentrations that never appeared before, as if someone spilled a bottle of ink across the page. These are the marks that might survive even when cities and machines are long gone. Imagine a civilization reaching the height of its abilities, building, shaping, consuming till it changes the very atmosphere. Maybe they burned fuels, or perhaps they invented materials that nature had never made on its own. Those materials, synthetic and stubborn, would have settled into the soil and the sea. Over time, they would sink into sediment, locked away like tiny, glittering secrets in the rock record. A geologist millions of years later might cut into that layer and see something unusual, but without context, might think it was simply an odd quirk of geology nothing more. That's part of the challenge. Natural processes can mimic the kinds of signatures an industrial civilization might leave behind. Massive volcanic events, for example, can flood the atmosphere with carbon dioxide, alter ocean chemistry, and leave behind layers rich in certain metals. Asteroid impacts can scatter exotic materials across the globe in an instant. The Earth has been through countless upheavals like these, long before humans arrived. Each one leaves a mark. The trick is figuring out if any mark is the result of intelligence rather than chance. And then there's the problem of time itself. The longer ago something happened, the more chances there are for its traces to be erased or disguised. A layer of sediment might be buried deep underground, folded and twisted by tectonic forces, or even recycled entirely into new rock. Just as an old photograph fades and cracks until the faces are unrecognizable, the planet's memories blur. With age we know this because we can watch it happen in miniature with our own creations. Think of a shipwreck on the ocean floor. For the first few years, it's still recognizably a ship metal hull, wooden decks, glass windows. But as the years pass, rust gnaws at the metal, currents scatter debris, and sea life claims the structure. For its own, a century later, it's a crumbling shell, and in 1,000 years, it might be nothing more than a strange bump on the sea floor. Now extend that process over 1,000,000 years. The wreck wouldn't just be gone. The very minerals would have been redistributed into the ocean's chemistry, as though it had never been there at all. This is why the Silurian hypothesis leans so heavily on the idea of indirect evidence. Direct evidence stools, buildings. Bones just doesn't last that long in most environments. But indirect evidence, like chemical shifts, can persist. We can already see our own chemical fingerprints spreading across the globe, the spike of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, the spread of synthetic polymers into soils and waterways, the telltale isotopes from nuclear tests. To future geologists, these will be bright lines in the rock record, sharp departures from the baseline rhythm of the planet. It's sobering to realize that, if some earlier civilization had existed, its most lasting impact might not be the beauty of its architecture or the complexity of its art, but the unintended side effects of its industries. The same could be true for us. Our most enduring legacy might be the changes we're making without meaning to, the things we see as temporary, disposable, or even harmful. This thought brings a strange kind of humility. We like to imagine our monuments as eternal, our achievements as unerasable. But the truth is, they are fragile in the face of deep time. The planet is not hostile to them, exactly, it's simply indifferent. Mountains crumble, rivers shift, ice advances and retreats, and in the process, every human mark is worn down until it's part of the background. And yet, this very indifference is what makes the question so fascinating. If we accept that the Earth erases its past, then the absence of evidence for an earlier civilization doesn't prove they never existed. It only means their traces didn't survive in a form we can recognize. Somewhere in the rock, there might be a chemical oddity, a sudden and unexplained change in the fossil record, a layer of minerals that shouldn't be there. It might be a whisper from a forgotten people, but without the right questions to ask, we'd never hear it. There's also the possibility that a past civilization might not have looked anything like ours. We tend to assume intelligence comes with certain hallmarks, metal tools, large cities, monumental architecture. But what if intelligence took a different path? What if they worked primarily with organic materials, things that decay quickly and leave no trace? What if their technology was based not on shaping the physical world into long-lasting structures, but on manipulating living systems, information, or energy in ways that wouldn't survive in the fossil record? If that were the case, even their existence might be invisible to us now. We could walk across what was once their heartland and see nothing but grass and stone. We might even pick up one of their tools without realizing it was a tool at all, dismissing it as just another oddly shaped rock. When you think about it this way, the search for past civilizations becomes less about digging in the ground for objects and more about changing the way we see. It's about learning to recognize the subtle fingerprints left by minds long gone. It's about opening ourselves to the idea that the Earth's story might be far more crowded, far more complex than the narrow chapter we currently inhabit. And maybe that's why the question has a certain dreamlike pull to it. It's not just about what we might find, it's about what it means if we do. If there were others before us, then we're part of a lineage we never knew existed. And if there weren't, then our chapter is the first of its kind, which is both exhilarating and terrifying. Either way, the thought reshapes the way we see ourselves, shrinking our certainty but expanding our sense of wonder. It's strange how the mind drifts when you start thinking in stretches of millions of years. In our daily lives, we measure time in minutes, hours, days. We count birthdays, anniversaries, the years we've worked at a job or lived in a home. Even a century feels vast to us, long enough to transform cities, erase memories, change the course of families. But in the language of the earth, a century is barely a breath, a single ripple on a much deeper ocean. When you step back into the realm of deep time, you start to see how fragile the record of life really is. Fossils, for instance, are rare. Not because life was rare, but because the conditions for preservation are so specific. An organism has to be buried quickly, shielded from scavengers and decay, and then protected from erosion for millions of years. Even then, most fossils are incomplete, fragmented, or altered beyond recognition. If this is true for the hard parts of living things, bones, shells, teeth, what chance do the softer, more transient creations of an intelligent culture have? A building made of wood might last a few decades before weather and insects consume it. A paper book might survive a few centuries under careful storage, but out in the open, it's gone in years. Even stone, which we think of as eternal, can be worn down shockingly fast under the right conditions. A civilization that thrived in a rainforest, for example, might vanish without a trace in just a few centuries after it was gone. The forest would take back the land, the humidity would eat away at every tool and wall, and the soil alive with insects and microbes would recycle everything back into itself. It's unsettling to realize that nature's default state is to erase. We tend to think of the world as a stage that holds the props of history in place, but it's more like an ever-changing tide that washes the sand smooth again and again. What survives from the past is not the full story, but the scraps that happen to land in the right place at the right time to be spared. Geologists sometimes talk about the bias in the fossil record, the way certain environments and certain types of organisms are far more likely to be preserved. We have more fossils of sea creatures than of land creatures, not because there were more of them, but because marine environments are better at burying remains in protective sediment. We have far more bones from hard-shelled animals than from soft-bodied ones, for obvious reasons. The same bias applies to the traces of civilizations. A culture that lived mostly on coasts would leave most of its remains in places now underwater. erased by shifting sea levels and buried beneath layers of sand and silt. And even if we did happen to find something from that far back, say, an artifact embedded in ancient rock, there's a good chance we might not recognize it for what it is. Without the context of its makers, without the surrounding evidence to tell its story, it could easily be dismissed as a natural oddity. A shaped stone might be written off as a quirk of erosion. A strange mineral deposit could be chalked up to volcanic activity. In science, the burden of proof is high, and extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. That caution protects us from jumping to conclusions, but it also means that some possibilities, however real, might remain forever invisible simply because they don't fit the framework we expect. This is where the imagination has to work alongside reason. We can't leap to wild conclusions, but we also can't ignore the gaps. A gap in the record doesn't automatically mean something happened there, but it also doesn't mean nothing did. The silence of the past is open to interpretation, and it's in that openness that the question of lost civilizations quietly lives. When you walk in the mountains, you can see the layers of rock exposed by time and pressure bands of color and texture stacked like the pages of a book. Each layer is a story, sometimes spanning thousands or millions of years. Some layers tell of oceans that once covered the land, others speak of volcanic eruptions, or of rivers that flowed and then vanished. If there was ever a chapter written by another civilization, it would be somewhere in those layers. But it might not look like a city or a tool. It might look like a sudden change in the types of fossils present, or an unusual concentration of certain elements, or a layer of sediment whose chemistry tells of a climate shift not easily explained by natural causes. And yet, even if we found such a thing, would we dare to say it was made by intelligent beings? Without more, without patterns or repetition, without artifacts clearly designed, the claim would feel too thin to stand on. That's the paradox of searching for the deep past. You have to find something that's both extraordinary enough to point to intelligence, and ordinary enough to survive millions of years without being erased or transformed beyond recognition. Sometimes I think about how this must look from the other side of the timeline. Imagine some distant future, tens of millions of years from now, when another species, perhaps intelligent in ways we can't imagine, begins studying the rocks beneath their feet. They find a layer from our time. They notice the strange spike in carbon dioxide, the odd scatter of synthetic materials, the extinction of countless species in a geologically short period. They might suspect something unusual happened here, but would they guess that it was the work of a civilization like ours? Or would they search in vain for the kind of evidence we ourselves expect monuments? Machines and, finding none, assume nature did it all on her own. There's something humbling in that thought. Our cities, our technology, our art of it could be swallowed so completely that the only hints left are changes in the chemistry of the planet. And even those hints could be mistaken for the byproducts of natural events. In that light, the idea of being remembered by the Earth feels far less certain than we like to believe. Maybe that's why the question of whether we're the first is both haunting and oddly comforting. Haunting, because it suggests that even the greatest achievements can vanish without a trace. Comforting, because it reminds us that we're part of a much larger, older story, one that's been told and retold in ways we can barely comprehend. We might not be the first chapter, and we certainly won't be the last, but for now, we're the ones holding the pen, even if only for a moment in the life of the Earth. Sometimes, when I think about the vastness of time, I picture the surface of the Earth not as solid ground, but as the skin of something alive, always shifting, breathing, healing over old wounds, and sometimes leaving faint scars. Those scars are where we look for the past, but the skin is constantly renewing itself. What's here today will not be here forever. The mountains we think of as immovable will one day be valleys. The valleys will rise into peaks. Shorelines will creep inland or pull away, and with each transformation, the record of whatever once stood there grows thinner, more fragile, until it disappears entirely. The forces at work are relentless. Rain doesn't seem dangerous when it falls softly on your roof, but given centuries, it can carve canyons and wear stone into dust. The wind may feel gentle on your face, yet over millennia it can sandblast rock into smooth curves. Rivers will change their course, flooding one plain while abandoning another. Glaciers, in their slow, grinding way, will scrape entire landscapes clean. These are patient forces, and patience is all they need to erase even the boldest marks left by living. Things, even the strongest human-made materials, are no match for them. Steel rusts, concrete cracks, glass shatters. In deserts, metal can last longer, protected from moisture. But even there, it is slowly worn down by temperature swings and abrasive sand. In wetlands, the opposite happens. Things decay fast, swallowed by vegetation and rot. And underwater, salt and currents conspire to break everything apart. If you wanted to hide the existence of a civilization forever, you wouldn't need to bury it. You could simply let time and the earth do what they've always done. This isn't to say that nothing survives. Some things do, usually by accident. We find fossils because certain creatures died in just the right conditions. We find ancient ruins because they were built in places that escaped the worst weather or geological upheaval. But these survivals are exceptions, not the rule. Most of what has lived or been built is gone beyond recovery. Think of all the human cultures we know, only through fragments, a few potsherds, a handful of tools, faint outlines of structures in the soil. And these are from the last 10,000 years or so, a blink of an eye. Now imagine pushing that back 1,000,000 years, or 10 million. The chances of finding anything recognizable shrink almost to nothing. The absence of evidence isn't proof of absence, but in the deep past, it's all too easy to mistake it for exactly that. What would the remnants of an ancient civilization even look like after such spans? Not the buildings themselves would be gone, but perhaps the altered landscape they left behind. Mining, for example, leaves scars in the ground that can last a long time, though eventually they too will soften and fade. Agriculture changes soil composition, sometimes in ways that can persist for thousands of years. Large-scale irrigation might leave unusual patterns in the sediment. But even these are vulnerable to the slow churn of the Earth's surface. That's why scientists who entertain the idea of a pre-human civilization focus on what they call signatures, chemical or isotopic anomalies that might be difficult to explain through natural processes alone. A sudden, sharp change in carbon isotope ratios could indicate massive burning of organic material, like fossil fuels. Unusual concentrations of certain heavy metals might suggest industrial activity. Synthetic compounds that don't occur naturally could be a giveaway if they could survive the chemical weathering of millions of years. The irony is that these same kinds of signatures are what we ourselves are leaving behind right now, often without thinking about it. The plastics we make are turning up in soils and sediments around the world. The fertilizers we use are altering nitrogen cycles on a global scale. The byproducts of industry are adding new and unfamiliar substances to the environment. If some distant future species were to study our layer in the rock record, they would find a sharp, unmistakable departure from the baseline fingerprint of a civilization that had spread across the planet. But whether they would recognize it as such is another question entirely. They might interpret it as the result of a catastrophic natural event, like a series of massive volcanic eruptions. Or they might decide it was caused by a short-lived burst of unusual conditions, without realizing those conditions were the work of intelligent beings. Without context, the difference between nature's chaos and civilization's impact can be difficult to see, and so the idea lingers, soft and unresolved. If others came before us, their story might be hidden not because it's impossible to find, but because we don't yet know how to read it. We might be walking over their chapters every day, unable to recognize the handwriting. Or perhaps their story is gone completely, dissolved into the slow tide of geological time, leaving nothing behind but the possibility that it once existed. That possibility is what makes the question so oddly soothing, even as it unsettles. Lying here, thinking about it, there's no rush to decide one way or the other. It's like looking out at the night sky and wondering if someone, somewhere, is looking back. The uncertainty is part of the beauty. It leaves room for the imagination to wander, to fill the silence with maybes. Maybe we are the first. Maybe we are one of many. Maybe intelligence is rare. Maybe it blooms briefly and fades over and over without ever meeting itself. The earth will keep breathing either way. It will keep turning its pages, adding new chapters, forgetting old ones. And somewhere in its deep, unhurried memory, the traces of all who have walked here, whether they built cities of stone or forests of thought, will settle quietly into place. If you've ever stood on the edge of the ocean and watched the waves pull sand from beneath your feet, you felt, in miniature, what the earth does to its own history. It takes what is solid and certain and draws it away, grain by grain, until only the vaguest outline remains. Sometimes the outline is enough to hint at what was once there. Most of the time, it's not. And yet, it's in those rare moments, when something survives the pull of time, that we catch a glimpse of how incomplete our knowledge really is. Archaeologists work with fragments. A shard of pottery here, a broken blade there, the faint stain of a post hole in the soil. From these they reconstruct whole ways of life, imagining the people who used these objects and the world they inhabited. But even at their most skilled, they are piecing together a puzzle with most of the pieces missing. For every ancient settlement we've found, there may have been 100 more erased without ceremony. For every artifact we hold in a museum, there are countless others that crumbled away before we could even guess they existed. That's in just a few thousand years. Stretch the scale out to millions, and the picture changes completely. The puzzle doesn't just have missing pieces, it's been dropped into the ocean, churned through storms, and scattered on a beach where the tide is still rising. We can pick up what washes ashore, but we can never be sure what was lost in the depths. It's easy to forget that the surface we live on is a thin, restless skin. Beneath it, the crust moves in great, slow currents. Rock sinks, melts, and rises again. Entire mountain ranges are swallowed, their stories broken into molten syllables and rewritten as new land. Anything resting on that surface is temporary by default. Without preservation in some rare, stable refuge, a cave sealed from the elements, a deep sediment layer protected from disturbance, nothing built or shaped can hope to last long in the grand timescale of the planet. That's why the traces we do find from deep time are often accidental. A forest turned to stone because volcanic ash buried it in moments. An insect preserved in amber because it wandered into tree resin. These aren't deliberate time capsules. They're lucky breaks, little pockets of preservation that slipped past the usual erasing forces. And luck is fickle. It doesn't favor complexity or intelligence. It simply happens where and when conditions align. If an ancient civilization had existed, luck would have needed to be on our side twice. Once, for some piece of their world to survive intact, and again for us to find it and recognize it for what it is. The odds are not generous. More likely, their works, if they had works, would have been transformed beyond recognition, their materials recycled into the bones of new landscapes, their shapes smoothed away until they looked no different from the stones beside them. This is where chemistry steps in as a kind of stubborn witness. While form is easily lost, substance can linger. Certain molecules, certain isotopes, certain patterns in the distribution of elements can outlast the structures they once composed. It's in these patterns that some scientists hope we might find evidence of civilizations older than our own. But even here, the search is tangled. Nature is prolific in her variety. She can produce anomalies without the help of intelligence. A volcano can enrich a region with heavy metals. A shift in ocean currents can alter carbon ratios in the atmosphere. The geological record is full of sudden, sharp changes that have nothing to do with technology or culture. To claim that any given change is artificial, you'd need more than a single oddity. You'd need a cluster of them, overlapping in ways that strongly resist natural explanation. The truth is, we haven't found such a cluster not yet, and maybe we never will. That doesn't mean the past is empty. It only means that, if others walked this world before us, they left lightly. Lightly enough that the earth could close over them without a scar we can read. There's a strange kind of comfort in imagining that. To walk so lightly that the planet takes you back without protest, without the enduring wounds of pollution or destruction. In a way, it's the opposite of what we're doing now. Our own age is leaving bold, undeniable marks. Greenhouse gases, synthetic materials, species extinctions. We will be readable in the rocks for a long time to come. But maybe there's wisdom in the idea that intelligence doesn't have to mean permanence, that it might mean knowing how to pass without a trace. Still, the curiosity is hard to quiet. Humans are drawn to origins, to firsts. We like to believe we are the beginning of something, the first sparks of mind and meaning in a silent universe. Yet the possibility that we're not, that we're part of a chain of rise and fall, with links hidden in the dark of deep time adds a richness too. Our story, it connects us not just to the life we know, but to the life we can only guess at when the night is quiet and the air is still. It's easy to let that possibility take root. You can almost feel it in the ground beneath you, the layered weight of ages pressing up through the soil. Somewhere in that depth could be the residue of other minds, dissolved into the chemistry of the earth. We may never see their faces, never learn their names, never know their triumphs or their mistakes, but their existence, if it was real, would mean that we too are temporary visitors, writing in sand that the tide will someday claim. And maybe that's enough. Not proof, not certainty, just the knowledge that the story is bigger than we can hold, and that we're part of it for a brief, bright moment. The rest is mystery, and mystery has its own kind of beauty. Sometimes I think about the way water, shapes a stone, not in a rush, not in a dramatic flood, but in the way a steady trickle, over years, can carve a groove you can trace with your fingertip. It's quiet work, patient and certain. That's how the earth edits its own history, not with sudden violence alone, but with small, constant touches that wear away detail until all that's left is shape, and then until the shape itself is gone. It makes me wonder what it would take for anything to survive all that time. Even our most durable creations are vulnerable. A steel bridge might stand for 100 years before rust and stress claim it. A granite monument might endure for thousands before wind and rain blur its edges. But millions of years, that is, not the lifespan of human handiwork, that belongs to mountains and continents, to the slow dance of tectonic plates. And yet, there are things that persist. Fossilized shells from creatures that lived in seas long vanished. Petrified wood that still holds the rings of trees which drank from ancient rain. Amber trapping the delicate bodies of insects that buzzed when mammals were still small and timid. These are not the grand works of civilizations, but they are survivors. And they remind us that survival in deep time is often a matter of accident, rather than intention. An ancient civilization, if it ever existed, might have left behind such accidents, a deposit of some unusual compound, created in quantities nature doesn't produce on its own. A pattern in the fossil recorder, sudden absence of species, or a proliferation of new ones that hints at deliberate change. Even a thin layer in the rock, rich in certain elements, might be a clue. But clues are slippery things. They can be read in more than one way, and without the rest of the puzzle. They can lead us anywhere we want to go. That's why science moves carefully here. The temptation to see patterns where none exist is strong. Our minds are wired for it. We see faces in clouds, animals in the stars, meaning in coincidences. To claim a lost civilization based on a single anomaly would be to risk mistaking nature's play for history's truth. And so, the evidence must pile high before we dare to speak. But in the quiet space of imagination, the rules are softer. You can let yourself picture a time before our time, when another species, perhaps not human at all, looked out over a world as rich and green as ours. They might have had their own languages, their own ways of shaping the land, their own dreams of the future. Maybe they never reached for the stars. Maybe they lived close to the earth, drawing what they needed without the hunger for more that drives us. Or maybe they, too, had cities, trade, and invention, rising to heights that must have felt as permanent to them as ours feel to us now. And then something changed. The change could have been their doing. Or it could have been the planet's shift in climate, a disaster from the sky. The slow tightening of limits they couldn't see until it was too late. They dwindled, they vanished, and the earth, indifferent, began the slow work of turning their works back into dust. In time, even their bones were gone. Their stories carried only in the faintest of whispers in stone. If such a people existed, would we recognize them as kin? Or would they seem too alien, their intelligence expressed in ways we can't translate? Intelligence doesn't have to look like ours. It doesn't have to build or write or farm. It can live in different rhythms, use different tools, seek different ends. And if its expressions left no lasting mark, then we could walk right past the traces without ever knowing. That thought stays with me. The possibility that we have already found things shaped by other hands, and we simply didn't recognize them. A rock picked up and studied for its unusual shape might have been a tool once. A formation dismissed as the result of erosion might have been a wall. The problem is not just that the past hides its treasures well, but that we don't always. No, we're looking at a treasure in this way. The earth is both generous and guarded. It gives us glimpses, fossils, artifacts, layers in stone, but never the whole picture. We are left to piece together what we can, and to accept that much will remain in shadow. That acceptance is not defeat. It's a recognition of scale. The story of the earth is so much bigger than we are, and we are lucky to read even a few lines of it. Some nights, I imagine what it would be like if we could turn the pages back, not in leaps of centuries, but in the slow motion of geological time, to watch mountains shrink and rivers change course, to see forests rise and fall, to see civilizations, if there were any, appear and fade like the passing of seasons. The picture that forms in my mind is not one of clear beginnings and endings, but of cycles. Life blooms, changes the world around it, and then recedes, leaving the stage for something new. Perhaps this is the real message of the missing chapters, that nothing, no matter how complex or brilliant, escapes the turning of the page, and if we are not the first to walk here, then we will not be the last. We are part of a pattern older than memory, and that is both humbling and strangely comforting. The earth remembers in its own way, and though we may never see the whole record, we are part of it now, woven into the layers that will one day lie deep beneath another's feet. If you've ever walked through a canyon where the walls rise high on both sides, you know the feeling of standing inside time itself. Each layer in that rock face is a chapter, pressed and hardened, telling of a world that once was. Some layers are thick, others so thin you can barely slide a fingernail between them. But each one is a fragment of a moment a million years, compressed into a band you could touch with your hand. It's humbling to stand there and realize that you are only the latest in an unbroken chain of readers, each of whom will pass before the book is even close to done. Looking at those layers, it's easy to imagine how much can vanish. The layers themselves do not say, in plain words, what lived on the surface when they were fresh. They do not carry the voices of the wind that moved through the trees, or the sound of footsteps on stone. Those things are gone, replaced by the language of minerals and fossils, a language we are still learning to read. And, like any language, it can mislead if we assume too much. The possibility of a forgotten civilization depends on the idea that even something as grand as a culture can leave behind nothing but this mineral record. No walls, no tools, no bones. Subtle changes in the chemistry of the soil, in the balance of elements, in the patterns of life and death preserved in the fossil record. To us, these would be anomalies, things that don't quite fit with what we expect. But the question is, would we recognize them for what they are, or would we fold them into the catalogue of natural events and move on? There is a kind of blindness in familiarity. When you already think you know the story, you stop looking for new characters. Geology has its expected players: volcanoes, meteor impacts. Climate shifts sand when we find a strange layer. It's natural to first look for one of these causes. To suggest an ancient intelligence is to step outside the usual script, and science asks for a lot before it will accept a new character into the cast. This caution is wise, but it is also a filter that may keep some truths hidden. Sometimes I wonder if the same thing could happen in reverse. We might mistake the works of nature for the works of intelligence. Patterns can be tricky that way. We find shapes and symmetries compelling, and it's tempting to see design in them. But nature is capable of producing complexity and beauty without conscious thought. If you've ever looked closely at a snowflake, You've seen how intricate a design can be when no designer is involved. And so, the search for the deep past is a balancing act between openness and skepticism. We must be willing to imagine possibilities without leaping to conclusions. That means accepting that some questions will not have answers we can prove, and that part of the story may always be guesswork. There's an odd peace in that uncertainty. It frees us from the need to have the last word. Instead, we can let the question live beside us, shaping the way we see the world without demanding resolution. It makes a walk in the woods feel different. You notice the curve of a stone and wonder if it's been shaped, the way it catches the light, the way it fits your hand. You look at the sweep of a valley and think about the millions of years that made it, and about what might have been there before. Perhaps this is why the idea of not being the first feels less like a threat and more like a widening of the horizon. It's not about losing our place in the story. It's about discovering that the story is longer and richer than we imagined. It invites humility, yes, but also a kind of kinship. If others walked here before us, they too faced the challenge of living on a restless planet, of carving out a life in a world that does not stand still. We don't know if they succeeded for a while and then failed, or if they chose a different path altogether. We don't know if they looked at the stars and wondered about other minds, as we do, but we can guess that they, like us, left traces without meaning to. That they too might have altered the balance of things in ways that could be read millions of years later, if someone cared enough to look closely. When I think about that, I picture a thread running through time. It's frayed in places, broken in others, but sometimes, just sometimes, the ends overlap, and you can feel the connection. The thread isn't made of proof, it's made of possibility. And sometimes, possibility is enough to change the way you walk through the world. You step a little more carefully. You pay attention to the ground beneath your feet. You imagine the lives that might have touched it before yours. The earth will go on weaving that thread, with or without us. And one day, far ahead, someone else may take it up, wonder about us, and tell a story about a people who lived long ago, whose works are gone but whose presence lingers in ways too quiet to measure. And maybe they, too, will never know for sure. There's a certain kind of silence you find only in the oldest places. It's not the absence of sound, there's always the wind, the murmur of water, the faint rustle of leaves, but something deeper, an absence of urgency. Standing in that kind of silence, you feel the weight of time pressing down gently, the way a blanket settles over you. The present feels thinner, as though you could slip through it and find yourself somewhere else entirely, someone else entirely. It's in places like this that the idea of a vanished civilization doesn't seem far-fetched at all. You start to notice how the land holds memory, not in the obvious way of ruins or monuments, but in subtler shapes. A slope that seems to even as if once leveled by deliberate hands. A line of stones that, from the right angle, forms a perfect arc. The brain wants to explain these things, to place them in the comfort of human history. But sometimes there's no clear match, no known culture, no documented event, and in the absence of a tidy explanation, the imagination begins to wander. Of course, imagination is not evidence. It's a doorway, nothing more. But sometimes that doorway opens onto ideas worth considering. If a civilization lived here millions of years ago, what would they have built with? Would they have chosen the same materials we do, or would they have shaped the world in ways that leave no obvious scars? If their tools were made of something that decays quickly, we would find nothing now. Even their bones, if they had bones, might be gone, transformed into minerals, indistinguishable from the surrounding stone. It's humbling to realize that even the most resilient markers of our own time, our metals, our glass, our plastics are not immortal. Given enough time, they too will break down. A city left untended will crumble in decades, collapse in centuries, and be unrecognizable in millennia. In 10 million years, the record of our presence might be reduced to a thin layer in the rocks, a subtle shift in chemical composition, and perhaps a few anomalies that make a future observer pause and wonder. The ocean hides even more. Most of human civilization today clusters along coastlines, and if sea levels rose dramatically, as they have in the past, vast swaths of our built world would be drowned. In time, storms and currents would tear them apart, scatter the debris, and bury it under layers of sediment. The continental shelves, now underwater, might hold the greatest secrets, but they're also some of the hardest places to study. Shifting sands, deep water, and the sheer expanse make exploration slow and incomplete. For a civilization millions of years gone, this problem is multiplied. The shorelines they knew might be hundreds of miles from where they are now. Entire continents have drifted since then. Their cities, if they had them, could now lie beneath mountains, deserts, or miles of ice. We might drill into a core sample and touch their world, without ever realizing it. Sometimes I wonder if that's already happened. If, in some quiet lab, a geologist has held a sample in their hand, puzzled over a strange mineral pattern, and filed it away as an oddity. Not because they lacked skill, but because they lacked the frame to see it as anything more. Our expectations shape our discoveries. We tend to find what we're looking for, and overlook what we're not. If you expect the past to be empty of intelligence before humans, you will interpret its anomalies through another lens. This is not a flaw of science, it's part of its strength. Caution protects us from wishful thinking, but it also means that some truths, if they exist, may hide in plain sight for a very long time, and maybe that's fitting. The earth has always been a keeper of secrets, and it gives them up only when the moment is right. Walking through these thoughts, you start to see the world differently. A rock outcrop isn't just a piece of geology, it's a page in the book. A change in soil color isn't just a quirk, it's a sentence written long ago. Even the air you breathe has been exhaled and inhaled by countless lives before you, circulating through cycles far older than humanity. In this light, the question of whether we're the first feels less like a puzzle to solve and more like a reminder to pay attention. Perhaps the most important part of this thought experiment isn't the answer, but the shift in perspective it creates. It pulls us out of the narrow corridor of recorded history and drops us into the vast hall of deep time, where our entire existence is a single step on an endless staircase. Whether or not others climbed these steps before us, we are here now, leaving our own faint footprints on the stone, and maybe that's the point. The earth doesn't measure worth in permanence. It doesn't favor one species over another. It simply carries on, reshaping itself, turning pages in a story that no single character can see from start to finish. If others came before us, they are part of that story. If we are the first, we are still just one chapter. Either way, the book goes on. I sometimes think about how strange it would feel to know, without a shadow of a doubt, that another civilization had come and gone long before ours. Not as myth, not as speculation, but as a confirmed fact, a truth carved into stone. Would it make us feel smaller, or would it make us feel less alone? I imagine it could do both at once, the way the night sky does when you stand under it and realize how vast it is. There's comfort in knowing you're part of something bigger, but also a quiet humbling in realizing your place within it, and yet, perhaps knowing would change very little about the way we live. We would still plant our crops, build our cities, tell our stories, but the knowledge might change the tone of those stories. Instead of imagining ourselves as the pinnacle, we might see ourselves as inheritors, stewards of a legacy we never knew we had. We might wonder what lessons were lost with those who came before, and whether we are destined to repeat their mistakes. This is one of the reasons the idea of deep time fascinates me. It puts everything into a scale where the rise and fall of civilizations' IRs included feels like the changing of the seasons. Civilizations bloom, reach their peak, and fade, not because they lacked brilliance, but because the conditions that sustain them shift, and nothing in nature is static. To the earth, this is neither tragedy nor triumph, it's just the way of things. When you think about it this way, you realize how fragile the evidence of any age really is. Even the geological markers we leave now, the spike in carbon dioxide, the spread of synthetic chemicals, will not last forever. Over millions of years, they will be diluted, altered, and overprinted by new events. One day, our Anthropocene layer will be just another page, sandwiched between chapters we can't yet read and chapters that haven't been written. It's strange to think that what we consider our boldest, most enduring achievements may not be what lasts. The skyscrapers, the dams, the highways, they may vanish completely, while the unintended side effects, like shifts in the nitrogen cycle or traces of rare earth metals, endure far longer. In that way, our most lasting monuments might be invisible to the eye, legible only to those who know how to read the language of stone. If another civilization existed before us, perhaps the same was true for them. Maybe they left behind no grand ruins because their works were swallowed by the earth, or because they built in ways that returned to nature quickly. Maybe their greatest achievements weren't physical at all. What if their true legacy was something intangible, knowledge, art, a way of understanding the world that vanished entirely when they did? In that case, the only trace would be the echo of their presence, felt but not seen. This is where the imagination is both a gift and a challenge. It allows us to fill the silence with possibilities, but it can also tempt us to see meaning where there is none. The scientist in me wants to be cautious, to hold back from declaring what I cannot prove. But the dreamer in me wants to wander through those possibilities, to picture what their lives might have been like, to imagine the feel of their cities, the sound of their voices. And maybe there's value in that, even without proof. Stories help us relate to the unknown. They give shape to the abstract and invite us to care about questions that might otherwise seem distant. In telling these stories, we remind ourselves that the earth has seen more than we can imagine, and that we are only a small part of its memory. Sometimes I like to think about the earth as a storyteller in its own right. Its tales are slow, measured, in millennia, spoken in the language of rivers and mountains. We're impatient listeners, we want answers now, clear and complete. But the earth doesn't speak that way. It leaves hints, pauses, and ellipses, forcing us to lean in and listen closely. And maybe that's why the idea of a lost civilization is so compelling. It's one of those long pauses in the Earth's story, a place where we can sense something missing, even if we can't quite say what it is. In the end, perhaps the question is less about finding definitive proof and more about how we choose to live with the uncertainty. We can take it as an invitation to explore more carefully, to question more deeply, to notice the subtle signs in the world around us. Or we can leave it as a quiet possibility, a mystery that keeps us humble in the face of all we don't know either way. The earth will keep turning, carrying the traces of all who have lived upon it, weaving them into its endless tapestry. And one day, far in the future, our own chapter will be just another thread in that fabric still there. Even if no one can read the pattern anymore, I think often about how the earth keeps its own counsel. It doesn't announce its history all at once, but releases it in fragments, like a storyteller who only speaks when the mood is right. Sometimes the fragments are of Vyasa, cliff face, striped with the colors of different ages. A fossil so detailed you can see the curve of a shell, or the texture of skin. Other times they're so subtle you might step over them without a second glance. A shift in the shade of the soil, a seam of mineral that shouldn't be there, a scatter of stones that looks random until you notice the rhythm in their placement. If another civilization had once existed here, I wonder if their memory survives in such quiet fragments. A layer of sediment enriched with some element they used in abundance. A patch of earth whose chemistry was forever changed by their farming, their fires, or their industries. We might walk over it now without a thought, never realizing that we are treading on the edge of someone else's world. This, I think, is the great challenge of deep history. Not that the past is gone, but that it's folded so completely into the present that we can't see the seam. The earth is always mixing, erasing, repurposing. Yesterday's forest becomes today's coal seam. Last year's flood deposits become the rich farmland of the next generation. And over the longest spans, the page is not just turned, but torn out and rewritten entirely. In the rare cases where something survives, it's often by accident. The eruption that buries a city in ash also protects it from weather and scavengers. The landslide that seals a cave keeps its contents untouched for millennia, but accidents can only preserve so much, and they happen only in certain places, at certain times. The odds are stacked heavily against anything surviving for millions of years, let alone surviving in a way that clearly reveals its origin. Even our most iconic human artifacts aren't immune to this. The pyramids may feel eternal, but give them enough centuries without care, and they too will crumble. Our steel towers, our concrete highways, our great bridges, they'll rust, crack, and collapse in far less time. In a few tens of thousands of years, most will be gone entirely, reclaimed by the shifting earth or worn down to anonymous rubble. If we accept that, then the absence of ancient ruins is no longer surprising, it's expected. It's not that a civilization millions of years old would leave nothing behind, but that what it left might be so transformed as to be unrecognizable. And if we did find something, a structure, an artifact, would we even know what we were looking at? Without context, without supporting evidence, we might file it away as a curiosity and move on. I imagine, sometimes, that there are drawers in museums filled with such curiosities, odd pieces of stone or metal that don't quite fit anywhere. Maybe they're labeled as natural formations or geological anomalies. Maybe no one has looked at them in decades. They wait quietly in the shadows, their stories untold because we haven't yet learned the language to hear them. The truth is, most discoveries are shaped as much by the questions we ask as by the evidence we find. If we aren't asking whether there could have been another civilization, we're less likely to recognize the signs. This isn't negligence, it's simply how our attention works. The world is full of information, and we see most clearly the things we're looking for. That's why thought experiments, like the Silurian hypothesis, matter. They don't claim proof where there is none, but they stretch our imagination just far enough to make new questions possible. They remind us that the story of life on Earth is longer and more complex than our recorded history, and that our own chapter might not be the only one worth reading. Even if we never find evidence of another civilization, the act of searching changes us. It teaches us patience, humility, and a kind of reverence for the deep processes that shape our world. It makes the ground beneath our feet feel alive in a new way, layered with possibilities we can't yet prove, but can still sense, like a scent, carried on the wind from far away. And perhaps that's the point, not to answer the question once and for all, but to keep it alive, to walk through the world with a little more curiosity, a little more awareness that the past is vaster than we can see, and that the Earth's memory is deeper than any archive we could build. One day, far ahead, someone else might walk where we are now. They might stand on a ridge and look down at the land, wondering about the people who once lived here. They might pick up a shard of something, stone, metal, ceramic, and turn it over in their hands, trying to imagine its purpose. And maybe they will feel what we feel now, that sense of reaching toward a story just beyond the edge of knowing. There's a certain humility in realizing that the ground beneath you is in many ways a palimpsest page written on again and again, each story partially erasing the one before. Sometimes the old ink bleeds through, and we catch a glimpse of what was there before our time. Other times, the page seems clean, yet beneath the surface are traces of sentences and thoughts we can no longer read. The earth writes in layers, and we are just one of them. When I imagine the possibility of another civilization long before ours, I picture them as both familiar and strange. Familiar in that they, too, would have grappled with the challenge of survival, of shaping their environment to meet their needs. Strange in that their form, their culture, their very concept of technology might be nothing like our own. We think of civilization in terms of cities, machines, and monuments because that is what we know. But those are human expressions of intelligence. There may be other ways to be advanced that leave little behind for the rocks to keep. Perhaps they built with living materials, plants and fungi woven into structures that vanished back into the soil without a trace. Perhaps they relied more on knowledge and coordination than on physical construction, creating a civilization as invisible to the geological record as wind or song. Even if they mined, farmed, or altered landscapes, deep time could have blurred those marks into natural patterns long before our eyes ever looked for them. We have to remember how selective the earth is with its memories. It doesn't preserve equally. It favors the rare event, a body buried in sediment, a sudden ashfall sealing the past in place, a cave untouched for millennia. The everyday for houses, the tools, the roads are almost always lost. What remains to us is an accident of circumstance, not a deliberate archive. That's why our own survival in the rock record will depend less on what we choose to preserve, and more on what happens to us after we are gone. A sudden catastrophe could freeze our world in place, the way Pompeii was preserved under volcanic ash. A slow decline might leave far less for the future to find. But no matter the ending, time will go to work on the remains, weathering, compressing, and transforming them until they are no longer recognizable to the eye. It's tempting to think that the traces we leave now, our satellites, our sprawling cities, our global networks, will make us impossible to forget. But permanence is an illusion. The earth has erased more than we have built, and it will do so again. If there were others before us, their traces might be just as scattered and transformed as ours will one day be. The real question is not whether the earth can forget, but whether we can imagine what it has already forgotten. In this light, the search for ancient civilizations is less about finding proof and more about expanding our sense of possibility. It's about letting go of the assumption that we are the first and only. It's about recognizing that deep time holds room for more than we know, and that our species' story is just one thread in a much larger weave. Sometimes, late at night, I picture a geologist millions of years from now, chipping away at a cliff face and finding a thin, strange layer. They study it under magnification and see particles of plastic, odd chemical signatures, and the fossilized remains of species long gone. They might puzzle over it, debate its meaning with others, and eventually write it into the record as a period of unusual change. Whether they guess the truth that it was the work of a technological civilization depends on the questions they are prepared to ask, and maybe that's where we are now, standing at the edge of a question we haven't fully learned how to ask. We have the tools to explore, the science to interpret, but our expectations shape what we see. To truly search for those who might have come before, we may have to learn a new way of looking, one that treats anomalies not as distractions, but as invitations. It might be that we never find anything conclusive. Or it might be that one day someone brushes the dust from a fragment of stone and sees, in its shape or its markings, the unmistakable work of a mind. If that moment comes, it will not just rewrite history, will remind us that we, too, will one day be the mystery. Until then, the question remains, humming quietly in the background of our thoughts. We live, we build, we dream, and somewhere beneath our feet, the earth continues to turn its pages, recording the things we do not even realize we're writing. There's a peculiar feeling that comes with walking across an empty field or a stretch of quiet forest and wondering how many lives have passed over that same ground. Not just people, but other creatures, other shapes of intelligence we may never know. The soil feels thicker when you think about it that way, as though it's holding not just the roots of the plants you can see, but the faint imprints of stories too old to name. It's easy to imagine those stories belonging only to animals, weather, and time. But sometimes I wonder, what if one of those stories was about a civilization, one that lived and breathed and built in the very place I'm standing, so far back that the earth itself has worn their memory smooth. In our minds, we tend to place civilization close to ourselves in time within the last few thousand years. We think of stone walls still standing, of pottery in the ground, of tools found in caves. But our species is just one recent leaf on a very old tree. The trunk stretches back hundreds of millions of years, and for most of that time, the tree's branches held no humans at all. Could another branch have borne a civilization long before ours? If they did, the challenge of finding them is not just a matter of digging deep enough. It's a matter of recognizing what we find. The signs might not look like anything we expect. A concentration of certain minerals in a sediment layer might be their legacy. A sudden and unexplained spike in atmospheric carbon, recorded in ancient ice or rock, could be the shadow of their industry. Yet without other clues, those anomalies might be explained away as natural. This is why the search is so elusive. The evidence, if it exists, hides among the ordinary. We might need to read patterns over vast areas to notice how small, scattered, anomalies fit together into a picture. That kind of insight requires a combination of patience, technology, and perspective qualities that take time to develop. It's possible that even if the signs are here, we don't yet have the eyes to see them. And maybe that's why the question lingers at the edges of science, rather than at its center. It's not that it's impossible, it's that it's so hard to frame in a way that allows for clear answers. For now, it lives in the space between disciplines, drawing on geology, archaeology, climatology, and imagination. It's a quiet question, content to wait while we learn how to ask it properly. I think about the ocean a lot when I think about this. More than 2/3 of our planet is covered in water, and much of it has never been explored in detail. If another civilization built along their coastlines, as we do, rising seas over millions of years could have hidden their cities far beneath the waves. Sediment would have buried them deeper still. Under that weight, even the largest structures would crumble, their shapes lost. What would remain might be nothing more than altered seafloor chemistry or faint traces of processed materials mixed into the rock. On land, the story would be no easier to read. Forests regrow, rivers shift, deserts swallow, volcanic eruptions cover entire landscapes in new layers, erasing whatever lay beneath. Glaciers grind the surface down, carrying debris for miles before letting it fall in a completely different place. In a world so dynamic, the survival of any clear evidence is rare and precious. It's humbling to realize that we too will face this erasure. One day, perhaps sooner than we think in geological terms, the traces of our presence will fade. The tallest towers will collapse. The widest roads will vanish under soil and roots. The brightest lights will go dark. And what will remain will not be the form of our creations, but the faint chemical aftertaste they leave behind. If there's any lesson in this, maybe it's that permanence is not the same as importance. A civilization can change the face of the earth in ways that last for millions of years, or it can live lightly and leave almost nothing behind. Either way, its reality is not diminished by the way time treats its memory. When I walk through places that feel untouched, I sometimes wonder if that's truly what they are. Perhaps they are simply well-healed. The earth is good at covering its tracks, turning the page so cleanly that you'd never know what was written before. And yet, I can't help but imagine that somewhere, hidden in the weave of rock and soil, there's a knot in the threaded place where the pattern shifts in a way that can't quite be explained. If we ever find such a place, it will probably seem unremarkable at first. Just another patch of ground, another core sample, another data set. The revelation, if it comes, will come slowly, as connections are made and the pieces align. And then, maybe, we'll realize that we are not the first to wonder about the deep past, that we are following in the footsteps of others who once looked out over their world and felt the same mix of curiosity and awe. That thought makes me feel less alone in time. It turns the vast, cold sweep of millions of years into something warmer, threaded with the possibility of kinship across ages. Whether or not we ever prove they existed, the idea that someone else may have walked this earth before us adds a layer to the way I see the world. It reminds me that our moment here is both unique and part of something much larger, and that one day we too will be only a possibility in the mind of someone far away in time. There's a comfort in imagining that, across the deep stretches of time, the earth has been home to more than one flicker of self-awareness, that maybe, long before us, there were other minds watching the sunsets, tracing patterns in the stars, and wondering about their place in it all. The thought feels a little like standing in a dark room and sensing that someone else has been there before. You not a threatening presence, just the lingering warmth of a life already lived. But if they were here, the earth has kept their secrets well. It's strange to think how completely the planet can close over a story. Even catastrophic events, which seem so overwhelming in the moment, become nothing more than thin lines in the stone after enough time has passed. A volcanic eruption that blotted out the sun for years might be remembered only as a streak of ash in a cliff face. A flood that swallowed whole valleys might leave behind nothing more than a layer of sediment. We tend to imagine history as a straight line, but deep time has no such neatness. It's full of loops and interruptions, of sudden changes and long stretches of quiet. If a civilization rose and fell millions of years ago, its rise might have been slow and unnoticed by the rest of the planet. Its fall could have been dramatic, or barely a ripple, and in either case, the record of its existence would fade until even the hints were hard to see. I often wonder how different we might feel about ourselves if we neutrally knew that others had come before. Would it make us more careful, knowing how easily a civilization can vanish? Or would it make us more reckless, thinking that disappearance is inevitable and therefore nothing to fear? The answer probably lies somewhere in between, in the complicated ways humans respond to the weight of history. Part of the challenge is that we define civilization in our own image. We picture tall buildings, complex tools, long distance, communication. We expect to see our reflection in the past. But intelligence doesn't have to look like us to be real. It might focus its efforts in places we overlook an understanding. Ecosystems so deeply that nothing is wasted, or on developing forms of expression that leave no physical trace. If such a civilization lived and died without carving itself into stone, our only chance of knowing it would be through the smallest of clues. Those clues might already be in our hands. A rock sample with an unusual chemical signature, a fossil bed that shows a sudden and unexplained shift in species diversity, a patch of soil enriched with elements in patterns that nature doesn't easily produce. These anomalies might be filed away, their significance unnoticed until a new question sends us back to look again. Science is full of such rediscoveries that seemed ordinary at first, but, in light of new understanding, turned out to be extraordinary. It's easy to forget how much of our knowledge rests on the questions we choose to ask. For most of human history, we didn't ask whether other civilizations had lived here before us. Our timelines placed us near the beginning, with everything older belonging to the realm of nature. Now, with our understanding of Earth's age and the resilience of life, we know there's room for far more in the past than we once imagined. And with that realization comes a kind of responsibility to look more closely, to leave space for possibilities we can't yet prove. I sometimes think about the possibility that we are, right now, creating the same kind of mystery for whoever comes after us. We don't mean to. We build, we consume, we alter the planet in ways that seem obvious to us. But in millions of years, much of what we've done will be invisible. The most enduring record of our presence might be subtle shifts in the chemistry of the rocks and ocean shifts that a distant future geologist could puzzle over, wondering if they mark the hand of intelligence or the whim of nature, and perhaps they'll never know for certain. Perhaps they'll feel about us the way we might feel about those who could have come before, aware of the possibility, but unable to prove it. The symmetry of that thought is almost comforting. It places us in a long, unbroken chain of questions each generation looking both backward and forward, aware of its own impermanence, but still reaching for understanding, whether or not others once walked this world. Their absence in the record reminds us that even the brightest light can fade without a trace. But it also reminds us that the value of a life, a culture, a civilization isn't only in how long it can be seen. Sometimes it's in the way it changes the world in its own moment, leaving an imprint on the flow of time that may not be visible, but is still real. And in that sense, maybe the lost civilizations, they existed, are not truly gone. They've been woven into the fabric of the earth, into the air and water, into the conditions that shaped the world we inherited. They may be gone as names and stories, but not as influence. Their legacy, like ours will be, is folded into the very substance of the planet, carried forward in ways we'll never fully trace. It's a strange thing, thinking about how influence can survive even when all other traces are gone. You can't see it directly, but you can feel it in the conditions that surround you, the shape of the land, the balance of life, the chemistry of the air. It's like walking into a room after someone has left and catching a faint trace of their scent. You don't see them, you don't hear them, but you know they were there. The earth works in a similar way. It absorbs what happens upon it, changes in ways that can last far beyond the moment, yet without preserving the details of how those changes came to be. A shift in ocean currents, the spread of a certain plant across continents, the disappearance of a species, these might all be ripples from a stone dropped long ago. If that stone was a civilization, its presence could live on in the way the planet adapted around it, even if every artifact it made has long since crumbled into dust. Sometimes, when I walk through a forest, I imagine the trees as newcomers, recent arrivals in a place that has been many other things. This hill might have been seafloor once. This clearing might have been a swamp, or a stretch of tundra, or the heart of a desert. In each age, life filled the space in ways that seemed permanent, until the earth turned the page. If a civilization lived here millions of years ago, the forest would not remember them, but the soil might, in ways we can't read yet. That's the puzzle of deep time. It doesn't play by the rules of human memory. We mark history by dates, events, the names of people and places. The earth marks it by layers and chemistry, by fossils and minerals. Its record is impersonal, stripped of context, waiting for someone to piece it together. But context is exactly what deep time erodes first. Without it, even the clearest sign of intelligence could be mistaken for nature's work. I think often about how we ourselves might appear in the far future. Imagine a world millions of years from now, where the continents have drifted into new shapes, the oceans have shifted, and new forms of life have taken our place. Somewhere in that world, a cliff might hold a thin line of sediment rich in plastics, heavy metals, and the isotopes of long-decayed nuclear materials. That line might be the only hint that we ever existed. A future geologist could run their fingers over it and wonder, was this just another natural event, or was it the echo of a civilization? It's easy to feel small in the face of that possibility, but there's also something freeing about it. Our marks on the earth may fade, but so will our mistakes. The planet will heal, reshape, and renew itself, as it has done countless times before. If others came before us, the same was true for them. Their triumphs and failures have been folded into the earth's long, patient recovery. And yet, the thought that we might be part of a repeating cycle raises questions we can't answer. If intelligence has bloomed here more than once, is there something in the earth's nature that calls it forth? Or is it purely chance, a rare convergence of conditions that can happen anywhere but happens only rarely? If it is chance, then perhaps we are a once-in-a-billion-years occurrence alone. In our moment, if it is something more, then maybe others will follow after us, as we might have followed others before. This is where the question becomes less about evidence and more about perspective. Whether or not ancient civilizations existed, imagining them forces us to step outside ourselves, to see our own moment as part of a much larger and more complex whole. It reminds us that permanence is an illusion, that dominance is temporary, and that intelligence, whatever form it takes, is just one of many ways life can shape the planet. I find comfort in that shift of scale. It takes the pressure off the idea that our civilization must be eternal, as though our worth depends on how long we can cling to the surface of the earth. Maybe what matters more is how we live while we are here. The quality of the chapter we write before the page turns. If others came before us, they had their own chapters known to us, but real all the same. And just as we cannot read theirs, those who come after may not be able to read ours. Still, the story will go on, so I walk a little slower, noticing the textures of the ground, the shapes of stones, the way a stream curves through the land. Somewhere in these details might be the faintest whisper of another age, too soft to prove but strong enough to imagine. And in that imagining, the world feels deeper, more mysterious, and more alive. Sometimes I think about how many times the world has been new, not just new to us, but truly remade oceans, drawing back to reveal fresh land, ice sheets retreating to uncover valleys, mountains thrust upward where there was once only plain. Each time, life has rushed in to fill the space, as if the planet were setting a table for a new round of guests. We are simply the current guests, seated for a brief span before the table is cleared again in that light. The possibility of earlier civilizations doesn't feel strange at all. It feels almost expected. The planet has hosted so many forms of life in so many eras, that to imagine intelligence arising more than once is no more far-fetched than imagining forests growing back after a fire. The challenge is not in believing. It could happen, but in accepting that proof might be impossible to find. The earth does not keep its past in tidy archives. It doesn't store blueprints or photographs. It keeps only what it cannot help but keep: stone, fossil, mineral, and chemical. Even these are constantly being altered, folded into new formations, ground down, or swallowed by the deep churn of tectonic plates. Anything that doesn't find shelter in some protected niche will eventually be reabsorbed into the endless cycle. Sometimes I picture an ancient city, not ours, but one belonging to some long-vanished people, standing in the sun millions of years ago. The streets are full, the air alive with voices, and the world feels as permanent to them as it does to us now. Then, slowly, the change begins: storms, shifting rivers, plants creeping over stone. Buildings crumble, walls collapse. Centuries pass, and the city is a ruin. Millennia pass, and the ruin is buried. Millions of years pass, and even the buried stones have been crushed and remade into something else entirely. Eventually, nothing of the city remains, except perhaps a subtle difference in the chemistry of the soil. If that is all that's left, how could we ever hope to connect it to the hands that built it? The clues would be so faint, so far removed from their origin, that they might be indistinguishable from the countless other changes nature produces. Unless the evidence is overwhelming, we would hesitate to call it artificial. That hesitation is a safeguard against self-deception. But it is also a wall that some truths may never climb. This is why the Silurian hypothesis is as much a lesson in humility as it is a scientific thought experiment. It reminds us that the absence of evidence is not necessarily evidence of absence. It also asks us to consider what our own layer in the rock will say about us when we are gone. We know it will speak because we are already altering the planet in ways that will outlast our species. But what will it say? And will those who come after us know what they are hearing? Perhaps they will see the sudden spike in carbon dioxide levels and guess at a warming world. Perhaps they will find traces of plastics in sediments and wonder about their origin. They might puzzle over the isotopic signatures of our nuclear age, or the abrupt drop in biodiversity as species vanished. Each of these would be a hint, but none alone would prove our existence beyond doubt. Without other context, they might seem like the fingerprints of a natural disaster, and that, I think, is what links us most strongly to the idea of those who might have come before. If they were here, their signs might be just as ambiguous to us as ours will be to the future. We are bound together by the nature of the record itself, partial, fragile, and open to interpretation. When I walk in the hills near my home, I often find small fossils in the rock shells, imprints of leaves, the spiral of an ancient sea creature. They are so ordinary, so common, that it's easy to forget each one is a survivor of impossible odds. For every fossil I find, there were countless others that left no trace. The same must be true for any sign of intelligence. The fact that we have not found them does not mean they were never there. It may only mean they were like those other shells and leaves, claimed by the silence before they could be preserved. In the end, I think that's what makes the question beautiful. It's not the hope of solving it once and for all, but the way it opens the mind to scales of time and possibility we rarely consider. It places us in a continuum we can barely see, and it reminds us that even if we are alone in our moment, we may not have been the first to hold it. And so I carry the question with me, not as a burden, but as a companion. It walks beside me on quiet days, whispers to me when I watch the wind move over a field, and rests with me under the stars. Whether or not there were others, it has already done what good questions do. It has deepened the way I see the world. There are evenings when the light is just right, when the sun is low enough that every contour of the land seems sharper, every shadow deeper. In those moments, you can see shapes you don't notice at noon, the gentle rise of an old riverbank, the faint hollow where water once pooled, the ridges where soil has settled unevenly over something long gone. You might not know what made them, but they hint at a past hidden beneath the present, and it makes me wonder how much of what we walk over is carrying the weight of forgotten worlds. Our own time feels so immediate, so undeniable. We can point to our cities, our technology, our networks that wrap around the globe. We feel permanent because we are surrounded by the works of our hands. But permanence is a trick of scale. Look closely, and you see the hairline cracks in the concrete, the rust blooming on steel, the vines that find their way through brick. Everything is already on its way back to the earth, even if we can't see it happening in real time. If another civilization stood where ours stands now, they must have felt the same certainty. They must have believed in the stability of their world, the durability of their creations. But time does not negotiate. It works in quiet, constant increments, and it always wins. That is why, if they existed, their memory has been so completely absorbed into the planet's deep history. When I try to imagine them, I have to resist the urge to make them too much like us. It's human nature to think intelligence must follow our path tools. Agriculture, writing, cities. But maybe they didn't build in ways that left monuments. Maybe their achievements were in harmony with the cycles of the earth, dissolving back into the environment without leaving obvious scars. In that case, the only signs we might find would be patterns in the chemistry of rocks or subtle disruptions in the fossil record things we might easily miss or misinterpret. This is what makes the search both frustrating and profound. We're not just looking for something, we're trying to learn how to recognize it when we see it. That means asking different questions, looking in places we might otherwise ignore, and accepting that the answer could be ambiguous. We might never have the kind of proof that satisfies everyone, but we might find enough to keep the possibility alive, and maybe that's all we need. The possibility alone changes how we see ourselves. It places us in a lineage that may extend far beyond what we can prove, a lineage where we are not the starting point, but simply the latest expression of something older and more mysterious. That shift in perspective makes our moment feel both more precious and less absolute. I think about this when I look at the stars. Somewhere out there, other civilizations might be wondering if they are the first on their own worlds. They might be searching their rocks and oceans for traces of forgotten ages, just as we do. The questions we ask here may not be unique to us. They may be part of the nature of intelligence itself, a curiosity about origins that reaches backward, as far as it looks forward. Back on Earth, the answers are locked in stone and sediment, waiting for the right eyes, the right tools, or perhaps just the right moment. We may never open those locks, but the act of trying matters. It keeps us looking more closely at the ground beneath us, more carefully at the patterns in nature, more humbly at our place in time, and it makes me think about the kind of traces we are leaving now. Not the skyscrapers or satellites, but the quieter, unintended marks, the composition of our atmosphere, the distribution of our waste, the rearrangement of ecosystems. These are the things that might persist long after the rest has faded. They will be our signatures in the rock, just as some earlier hand, if there was one, might have left theirs. In the far future, perhaps someone will study those signatures. They will wonder what kind of beings we were, what we valued, how we shaped our world. And maybe they will never know for certain. But they will know this, that we were here, and that for a brief moment we left our own chapter in the endless book of the earth. There's a certain magic in standing somewhere that feels untouched, even though you know it isn't. A windswept plain, a high mountain meadow, a stretch of rocky short places that seem beyond the reach of human hands. But untouched is only an illusion. Everything has been touched in some way by something before. The wind has shaped the land, water has carved it, life has walked it, and time has pressed its weight into every stone. When you let yourself think on longer scales, you realize that before can stretch back unimaginably far. Millions of years open behind you like a horizon without end. And somewhere in that distance, the possibility of another civilization waits not as a certainty, but as a quiet question. Did others live and dream here long before us? Did they stand in places like this, looking out over their own world, and feeling the same mix of wonder and belonging? If they did, the earth has folded their time into its own. The landscapes they knew may be gone entirely, replaced by mountains where there were oceans, or deserts where there were forests. Even the air they breathed might have been different. The only things that could survive such change are the most resilient traces patterns in rock, shifts in chemistry, echoes too faint for the untrained eye to notice. And perhaps that's the most challenging part, recognizing those echoes when we see them. Our minds are tuned to the familiar. We know how to identify the signs of human presence, walls, carvings, the marks of tools. But if another intelligence followed a different path, their traces might be invisible to us, or so alien in form that we would mistake them for natural. That's why the work of searching is as much about expanding our imagination as it is about finding evidence. It requires us to step outside our own way of thinking, to consider that intelligence might not always leave the kinds of marks we expect. It might live lightly, blending into the fabric of the planet instead of carving itself apart from it, or it might create, in mediums that time cannot hold, sound, light, organic forms that dissolve completely back into the world. If that is the case, then the absence of ruins tells us nothing. The quiet landscapes we walk could be full of ghosts, not the haunting kind, but the remnants of lives so perfectly reabsorbed into the earth that only the earth remembers them, and maybe the earth prefers it that way. The planet doesn't distinguish between natural and artificial. It doesn't hold one kind of creation above another. It simply takes in whatever comes, breaks it down, and uses it to build something new. In that sense, even if a civilization is gone beyond recognition, it still exists, transformed, redistributed, woven into the next chapter. I think about this often when I see old buildings being overtaken by plants. First the cracks appear, then the moss, then vines and saplings. In a surprisingly short time, the structure changes from something clearly made by hands to something that looks as though it grew there. Give it more time, and even that distinction disappears. It becomes part of the landscape, indistinguishable from the stones and soil around it. Multiply that process by millions of years, and the boundary between life's creations and the earth's own work vanishes entirely. This is why, if others came before us, their memory would be so hard to recover. Not because the planet is hostile to memory, but because it is endlessly creative, endlessly in motion. The same forces that allow life to flourish also ensure that its traces are temporary. But there's a kind of grace in that impermanence. It means that the earth is always ready for renewal, always making space for what comes next. And if we are part of a cycle that has played out before, then we are also part of its renewal. Whether or not others walked this path before us, we are adding to the story. Even if our chapter will one day be unreadable, it's possible that's the real lesson in all of this, that meaning doesn't depend on being remembered forever. A civilization can matter profoundly in its own time, shaping the lives within it, changing the planet in ways both deliberate and accidental. The fact that those changes may one day be untraceable doesn't erase their value. It only reminds us that permanence is not the only measure of worth. So when I think about the civilizations that may have come before, I don't imagine them as failures for disappearing. I imagine them as part of the same living process we belong to now, brief, bright intervals in the vast unfolding of time. And maybe, somewhere deep in the earth, their presence still hums quietly, like the fading vibration of a bell long after the sound is gone. There are days when I find myself staring at a horizon and thinking about how many different worlds have existed under the same sun. Not different planets, just different versions of this one. Worlds with coastlines drawn in new shapes, with mountains that have long since worn away, with forests and deserts and seas arranged in patterns we would barely recognize. Each of those worlds was home to its own web of life, and each, in its time, felt complete to those who lived in it. If a civilization rose in one of those worlds, its reality would have been no less vivid than ours. Its people would have had their own names for the rivers and the stars, their own ways of measuring time, their own sense of what was worth building and preserving. They would have felt the same mix of certainty and uncertainty that we do, the sense that life goes on, but that change is always near. And just like us, they might have struggled to imagine their world as anything but permanent. But permanence is the illusion that deep time is best at shattering. The surface of the earth is always shifting. Continents drift, climates swing, seas rise and fall. Whole ecosystems vanish and are replaced by others, as though the planet were constantly rearranging the stage for a new act. If another civilization once played its part here, the stage they knew is gone, replaced by scenery they could not have imagined, and that is part of why finding them would be so difficult. We are looking for traces in a set that has been rebuilt, over and over again. The props are gone, the backdrop is different, and even the floor beneath it has been torn up and laid down anew. What's left might be no more than the faintest hint of something that doesn't quite match the rest. I sometimes imagine a moment, far in the future, when someone does find such a hint, an anomaly so strange and so consistent that it resists every natural explanation. At first, it might seem insignificant, just another puzzle in the vast catalogue of Earth's geology. But then, with time and study, the pieces could begin to fit together, forming a picture no one had expected. That picture might not tell the whole story, but it could tell enough that intelligence is not unique to our moment, and that the Earth has hosted it before. Would that change us? I think it would. Not in the sense of altering the day-to-day details of life. We would still need to work, eat, and rest, but in the sense of deepening our connection to time. We would no longer see ourselves as standing at the dawn of awareness, but as inheritors of a much older tradition. Even without knowing their names or their stories, we would feel joined to them by the shared act of looking outward and wondering. But perhaps the discovery will never come. Perhaps the traces, if they exist, are too faint, too altered, too well hidden by the planet's endless cycles. In that case, the question will remain unanswered, as it has for so long. And maybe that's not such a loss. The absence of an answer leaves space for imagination, and in that space, the mind can wander freely. There's a certain humility in leaving some questions open. We tend to think of knowledge as something to be completed, like a puzzle with a final piece. But the universe is not a puzzle, it's a landscape, vast and varied, with more horizons than we can reach. Some horizons are worth traveling toward, even if we know we'll never get there, because the journey changes the way we see everything along the way. The question of whether we are the first is one of those horizons. Even without proof, it shapes the way I notice the world. It makes me pay closer attention to the details, the layering of rock in a road cut, the color shift in a patch of soil, the strange symmetry of a stone. These things may have ordinary explanations, but in looking at them through the lens of possibility, they become alive with potential meaning, and in the end, that's what keeps the question worth holding on to. Whether or not we ever find the answer, it reminds us that our time here is part of something vast, and that the Earth's story stretches far beyond the span we can see. It invites us to imagine ourselves not as the sole authors of that story, but as participants in a narrative that has been told before and will be told again. in ways we cannot yet imagine. There's a quiet power in accepting that the earth does not need us to remember its past. It carries on regardless, shifting and remaking itself, turning forests into deserts, mountains into valleys, seas into plains. The record of those transformations is written in languages we are still learning. To read bands of color in rock, the arrangement of fossils, the chemistry of ancient ice. And even in those records, so much is missing. We notice the absences when they are close in time to us, when a culture disappears from written history, or when a site erodes before it can be studied. But in deep time, absence is the norm. Entire worlds have passed beyond recovery, their details erased until only the faintest hints remain. If a civilization once thrived millions of years before us, then almost everything about them, how they looked, how they thought, how they lived, have been carried away by those same slow, relentless forces. This is not cause for despair, but a reminder of scale. We live in a thin slice of the Earth's history, a moment that feels vast to us but is just a breath to the planet itself. The fact that we can see even fragments of what came before is a kind of miracle. And if there were others, the fact that we can imagine them at all might be the closest we ever get to meeting them. Sometimes I try to picture what it would mean for their story to be found, even in part. Maybe it would be a single artifact, something so clearly shaped by intention that it could not be dismissed as natural. Or maybe it would be a pattern repeated across multiple sites, too deliberate to be the work of chance. Whatever form it took, the realization would ripple through our sense of identity. We would no longer be the first chapter in the story of intelligent life on Earth. We would be a sequel, perhaps one in a series. And if we learned that, what then? Would we search for the reasons they vanished, hoping to avoid the same fate? Would we find cautionary tales in their remains, or would we see only the inevitability of impermanence? I think the answer would depend on how much of them we could actually know. The more complete the picture, the more lessons we could take. But if all we had was the knowledge that they existed, then maybe the only lesson would be that life, in its many forms, can rise again and again from the same soil. That thought changes the way I see our own presence here. It makes me think less about how to preserve what we've built forever, and more about how to make our chapter worth reading while it lasts. If the page turns and our words are erased, then the value will have been in how we lived, not in how long we were remembered. Still, there is something deeply human about wanting to be remembered. It's why we build monuments, write books, record our voices. It's why we mark our names on walls and carve symbols into stone. We want to leave something that says, I was here. And maybe that desire is not unique to us. Maybe, if others came before, they too wanted to leave their mark, only to discover, as we may, that the earth has no obligation to keep it. The earth's memory is selective. It keeps what fits into its own cycles, and it lets the rest go. A fallen tree becomes soil. A fallen city becomes stone. Over long enough spans, both are just layers in the same rock face, indistinguishable to all but the most careful observer. To the planet, there is no hierarchy between nature and civilization, only the endless process of change. And perhaps that is why the question of being the first feels so mysterious. It's not just a question about the past. It's also a question about how we fit into that process. Are we a singular event, or part of a repeating pattern? Will our presence here echo in ways we cannot predict, shaping worlds we will never see? The answer might be locked away, but the asking changes us. Because when you hold this question close, you start to see the ground differently. You notice the way the layers of soil meet the bedrock. You notice how the wind shapes a dune, how water smooths a stone. You notice the way life takes hold in the smallest cracks. And you begin to understand how even the most enduring things can be remade. In that awareness, you find both humility and connection. Humility in knowing we are temporary, and connection in knowing we are part of something vast and ongoing. And maybe that's enough. Maybe the point is not to know for certain, but to live as if the story we are writing matters, even if the next readers are millions of years away or never come at all. I sometimes imagine the last moments of our chapter, not in a grim way, but in the way you might imagine the closing of a book you've loved reading. One day may be far in the future, maybe sooner than we expect. Our cities will quiet, the lights will fade, the structures we've built will stand for a time, then falter, then fall. Grass will grow where we once paved roads, trees will split the stone of our tallest towers, wind will sweep through what remains, carrying seeds into cracks and corners we thought belonged only to us. From there, the work of erasure will be slow but certain. Water will soften the edges, roots will break the foundations, frost will expand in the smallest gaps, widening them year after year. Animals will return, nesting in the hollows of buildings, hunting along overgrown streets. In centuries, our monuments will be ruins. In millennia, they will be indistinguishable from hills and ridges. In millions of years, they may be gone, entirely folded into new rock, hidden beneath layers of earth, or ground to sediment at the bottom of seas. If someone comes after us, whether they are our descendants, a new branch of life entirely, or something we cannot imagine, they might never know the details of who we were. They might find the faintest traces, a chemical shift in the air trapped inside ancient ice, a thin layer of sediment rich in strange compounds, an abrupt change in the fossil record where countless species disappeared. From those hints, they might begin to guess, but without the full picture, we would be as much a mystery to them as any who might have come before are to us now. And perhaps they will ask the same question we do: were we the first? They will look at the deep past, search for signs of other minds, and weigh each anomaly with care. Maybe they will find nothing and conclude they are alone in their time. Or maybe they will find something that changes everything, proof that life has reached for thought and meaning more than once on this planet. Either way, they will be part of the same cycle, wondering, searching, imagining, in thinking about those future minds. I find a kind of kinship that crosses time in both directions. We share curiosity not just with each other, but with all who might have asked these questions before us and all who might ask them after. Even if we never meet, we are connected through the act of wondering. That connection is as real as any physical trace we might leave. It also reminds me that our time here is not guaranteed. The earth doesn't promise permanence to any of its creations. It offers moments, some long, some brief, and then it changes the stage. To live well within that truth is to accept the limits of our control while still making the most of our presence. It's to build, not because our works will last forever, but because they matter now, to us and to those we share this moment with. The question of whether we are the first will likely remain unanswered, but maybe that's not a failure. Maybe the purpose of the question is not to close it, but to keep it open, an invitation to see ourselves differently, to recognize that the line between nature and civilization is thinner than we think, and to understand that the Earth's story is much larger than the part we play in it. As I sit with that thought, the world feels quieter but not empty. The silence holds layers. Beneath the sounds of the present, there is the weight of the past, the press of all the lives and moments that came before, known and unknown. And beneath that, there is the possibility of futures we cannot imagine. We are suspended between them, writing in our own voice for as long as we can. One day, someone may turn the page and find our words faded, our images gone. They may wonder about us, just as we wonder about those who might have come before. And in that wondering, they will keep the thread unbroken, carrying the question forward into their own time. Perhaps that is the real permanence, not the monuments we leave behind, but the questions that outlive us. Questions like this one, quiet and enduring, waiting in the shadows of deep time. What if we were not the first? And maybe, just maybe, the earth smiles in its own slow way, knowing the answer, holding it deep in the layers where only time can read.